This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Hi everyone. Just wanted to extend a very warm welcome to everybody who has joined us on Zoom today. I'm Jeannie Lee, Head of Region for Asia, and I'm very, very pleased to welcome you to an interesting conversation that we've got with a wonderful panel, and I'll be shortly introducing our panel just after this. Today's Zoom webinar is brought to you by Ashurst and Asialink. We've had several years of collaboration between Ashurst and Asialink, just in terms of bridging events with professionals in Australia as well as in Asia. Today's webinar is really about how we push women and female leadership in a very difficult time of the COVID pandemic. I think in times like these, people are looking towards leaders in terms of how to lead, what the playbook is, and clues really on how businesses are to survive and thrive in a very difficult time. I just wanted to take you through in terms of our panel today. So I explained that I'm Jeannie and I'm a lawyer in Ashurst, Head of Asia. I specialize in debt capital markets. And what that really means is that we help companies to raise debt finance. I've practiced for almost 20 years in London, Singapore, and currently I'm based in Hong Kong. I'm also passionate about diversity and inclusion, in particular on encouraging and uplifting young women to be involved and to further their careers. I have 3 young children, ages 5, 7, and 3. So part of my challenge, and also what I think one of the main topics we'll talk about today, is really on how women can learn to balance their lives and careers, particularly during this very difficult and stressful time. Penny Burt is going to be our moderator today. Penny is the Group CEO for Asialink, and she's got more than 25 years of experience in diplomacy, trade, and investment. And she has a career spanning an impressive business, government, and non-profit sectors. Georgette Tan is also on our panel. Georgette is the president of United Women Singapore, an NGO which advocates gender equality, women's empowerment, and is focused on building the pipeline of female leaders. She's also on the board of the Singapore Council of Women's Organizations and is chair of Board Agenda, focusing on increasing the women on board positions. Very pleased to also introduce Jessica Hamm. Jessica is a counsel with us at Ashurst, and she's an LNG and natural gas energy specialist based in our Singapore office. Leonie Valentine is also on our panel today. Leonie is the Managing Director, Sales and Operations of Google Hong Kong, and she had joined Google as APAC Director of Customer Experience prior to that, and has over 25 years of experience in sales, marketing, and operations. So just handing over to Penny today, who will take us through the panel.
Jenny, thank you very much to you and Ashurst for your partnership and for this fantastic opportunity to come together today on this very important topic. Before we start, I would like to formally acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we work and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. In terms of very briefly for housekeeping rules for today, because we have many, many participants on the line, and thank you all very much for making available time. It's so great to see, can't see you, but to know that there are so many friends and supporters joining us today. Could I just remind everybody, if you can have your cameras off and be muting, we are going to have the opportunity for you to use the question and answer function in Zoom to interact with our panel today. And if there's anything you need to tell us, please let us know there. The format this afternoon is a panel discussion between our senior women leaders for around 20 to 25 minutes, followed by an open Q&A with all of you. We do very much wish it was live, but you will understand today we're sitting here I'm in Australia. We have participants from all across the region, particularly Hong Kong and Singapore, but much more widely. And it's fantastic, actually, that the technology allows us all to come together like this. Before we kick off this afternoon formally, I just wanted to provide some very brief context for our discussion. It's always really interesting to discuss gender diversity, parity, and women's leadership. They're all enormous passions of mine, and I know of many of ours. However, our discussion today is taking place at an extraordinary time against the backdrop of the COVID-19 global pandemic. It is really clear that the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on women. According to a brand new report from McKinsey & Company, while women make up 39% of global employment, unfortunately, they currently account for over 54% of global job losses in the period of COVID. At the same time, sadly, reports that suggest with uncertainty and extended lockdowns, domestic violence has increased as economic uncertainty for women is taking hold. Existing gender inequalities have actually made women more vulnerable to the economic effects of COVID-19. Women are bearing a disproportionate share of unpaid work at home and are often employed in casual or part-time jobs and in sectors such as retail or hospitality that have been really, really hard hit. Against that backdrop, I would like to turn to our panel and discuss the ways in which they have experienced the pandemic, how as leaders they've found resilience, and a little bit about their personal journeys as senior career women and their organizational experience. So with that, Ginny, Jessica, Georgette, and Leonie, please join me for our discussion. Thank you. Great to see you all. There you go. There you are, all up in red. Ginny, you're a senior professional woman leading Asia for a major law firm, as well as a mother, and I take my hat off to you. Three children. How has COVID-19 impacted you as a senior woman leader and a professional?
Thank you very much, Penny. I think if you had told me a year ago we would be doing a Zoom webinar for sort of over 200 people, I wouldn't have believed you. Just yesterday, I was celebrating a good friend's birthday, and about 20 of us got together on a Zoom webinar, and we wished her a very happy birthday. Again, if you told me a year ago that I would be having to have birthday parties on Zoom, I wouldn't have believed you either. So I think COVID has sort of fundamentally changed the way that we live, the way that we work, and the way that we communicate and deal with each other today. From a work perspective, I mean, the change is astonishing. I would ordinarily have been on a plane sort of every other week traveling. I would have a bag which is ready to go and packed, and it's part of the job really to sort of jump on a plane and to see our clients face to face, because very much in Asia, I think one of the traditional ways to do business is a face-to-face meeting, and until you've sort of looked at someone in the eye, shaken their hand, and there I think the trust is really formed. So I think it's been difficult and challenging in terms of work. Having to deal with technology, having to deal with sort of meeting and building trust with clients on a virtual level. In terms of organization itself, we've also had new joiners that have joined us during this time. Extremely difficult for new people to do organization. I think a lot of us have been using relationships that have been banked with sort of the years of trust and the years of cooperation that have been built up, and we're sort of chipping away, I think, at that little bank. But for new people who have joined our organization, it's extremely difficult for them to meet anyone at this time. So what we've done is also done a lot more things in video format. So we've been pushing out videos of people in terms of introducing themselves, in terms of trying to build some sort of personal connection through a video format, which is challenging. And I think all of us are still trying to accustom to the new way of working. And on a personal level, so with 3 kids, I was just telling this panel today that I had attended my first Zoom online class for my 3-year-old. And anyone who sort of thinks a 3-year-old can sit still for 20 minutes on a Zoom class is, it's it's extremely painful. So this morning we just had to do that. And again, sort of teaching the rules of technology to young children, thinking about how we protect them from the internet and not to expose them to too much screen time. So I think all that is something that working parents are now grappling with.
That's really interesting. And I think the point that you've made about not getting on a plane every week is, I think, a really big one for many, many of us who, spend our professional lives needing to travel to connect with people. It's very much changed the dynamic for a lot of us in the way that we do business. Turning to you, Jessica, we've all been in various stages of working from home over, since the start of the pandemic, and that varies from country to country and is changing from period to period, depending on the state of the pandemic. What has that experience been like for you as a professional woman and someone who is living currently in Singapore? And what has it really meant in both your professional life and your home life?
Sure, thanks, Penny. I would have to echo some of Ginny's comments around the fundamental change to the way we work. One of the reasons that I am based in Singapore, I moved up here about 5.5 years ago from Australia, and a real draw card for me was to be in this market and to be able to travel to see our clients, to do that exciting work. And we've had to fundamentally change the way we approach that and find ways to connect, across the technology divide and to make that work. So that's been a huge change for us. For me also, I have always worked full-time in an office. So 6 months ago, when the government directive in Singapore became, if you can work from home, you should work from home, and we took that on board. We've been working from home as an office for that full 6-month period. That again was just a huge, huge change for me. My personal circumstances are a little bit different to the ones Ginny just described. So I know, working parents everywhere have had some incredible challenges the last 6 months. I don't have children and I live alone. So the last 6 months during a period of lockdown, going from daily interactions with a huge range of colleagues and friends to being at home alone for a large part of my life has been very challenging. And I know I'm not the only one in that situation as an expat working in Asia. For a lot of us, our families are a long way away, and our support network are the friends that we have in this, in the countries where we live, and the support network we have through our professional capacity as well. So it's been really, really interesting for me, challenging certainly, but it has opened my eyes to the fact that there are a lot of others in that same situation as me, and for leaders in this region navigating through this time, issues around engagement of teams and resilience and managing that feeling of potential isolation have become hugely important. And I think leaders have had to skill up really quickly in that area where, those daily, the sort of incidental interactions you might have in a workplace can be enough to keep in touch with others. But now that we are physically located, away from each other, that sort of level of personal check-in and empathy and being completely conscious of the fact that everyone's had a different experience through this. I think that's really stood out to me as something that has been something leaders have need to grapple with over this period, but something that could be a really positive change going forward.
That's really interesting, Jessica. I think you've touched on a number of really important issues about the way in which leadership needs to evolve in a context like this. Leonie, as a senior leader with Google, the explosion in everybody's digital world as we're using digital platforms to connect, and whether it's in our personal lives or, daily, hourly for most of us in our professional lives. it would be really interesting to hear from you what digital enablement has meant during COVID, and particularly what digital enablement has meant for women in this period.
Thanks for the question, Penny. I think it's really interesting because if you follow tech like I do, it's kind of an occupational hazard. None of this is new. Mm-hmm. So I've been in the tech industry since 1999. That's when I first got my start in internet. I used to run the innovation centres for Telstra in Australia, where we demonstrated this kind of technology all of the time. You know, and those centres were opened, I think, around 2003, 2004. So we're talking about the concept of technology that has been available for decades. The challenge always with technology is technologies have moments in time. So, you know, if there's no need from the users and the technology is not easy enough to use, it doesn't get widespread adoption. So they always say, you know, necessity is the mother of invention. And I think that's probably what's happened in this particular pandemic. So, you know, what we're seeing, and it was Satya Nadella, the Microsoft CEO, said they're seeing 3 years of digital transformation in just 3 months because of the pandemic, right? So organisations have been forced to move. Digital enablement is both blessing and curse for women. So it's a blessing in that it provides increased flexibility and representation. So what's actually happened is you'll see that meetings like this, where women naturally wait for their turn, and you'll see, you know, the data actually supports this. A lot of men will end up showing up in meetings because of their, you know, strength of personality. They're used to we've heard all the leaning in kind of circle type advice. What we're actually seeing in the use of video technology in the workplace, for organisations that are getting it right, we're seeing a more inclusive culture emerging because everybody is now on the same playing field. So previously you might have had a remote employee, say your office is in Singapore and you've got a remote employee, just one person in the Philippines. That person always felt like the odd person out, or if they were working from home. Now everybody, it's actually a level playing field. So what we hope is we'll see an increase in that representation and an increase in inclusion and inclusive meetings as we go forward. So that's great. On the con side, we actually see increased home responsibility. You know, as Ginny was saying, I don't envy her having 3 kids, you know, 3, 5 and 7. I stopped at 2 years apart because I found out what was causing it, so there won't be any more. I do not have any more kids. My children are teenagers. And, you know, I've actually, on a personal front, I've been separated from my family for most of this year. So my husband and my children are in Melbourne. I'm at home alone in Hong Kong with my lovely helper, Lynn, and my 2 cats and my 2 turtles that my kids kindly left me. And I spent 3.5 months here before I decided that I couldn't wait any longer for the pandemic to break, and I went back to Victoria. So I just spent the last 2 months back in Australia, and for the first time in the last decade, you know, without the assistance of a helper in Hong Kong, because I've been here for 9 years, suddenly I was back experiencing what a lot of my team are experiencing. I was both homemaker, managing director, kid wrangler, you know, and everything in between, bottle washer, you name it. And I think the really interesting thing about that is just realising how much increased responsibility that you have when you step back into these environments, and having, I think, a bit more compassion for my team members who typically, because I live in Hong Kong, typically live in very small apartments and possibly with 3 generations of family. And then this element of distraction in terms of getting up and getting ready for my day, and then realising that my kids weren't up because normally there was this routine of getting them out of the house to school. And in fact, our children were in boarding school, but all of that's closed in Victoria. So there's all this other layer of responsibility that comes in. So I think for women, it's a yay, we can do more and be seen more, and boo, we have to do more at both work and at home and be seen more often. So I think, you know, from a technology perspective, what I'm looking for is sustaining positive change. You know, I really hope we can shift the mindset of managers, that it's not about seeing somebody sitting at their desk until past 6 o'clock that determines who is your best employee. It's about outcomes. I think the second thing is that we have to think that you don't always need to be available. You have to allow people to have the same flexibility that they would have had in the office in terms of, I went to get a coffee, I'm taking a bio break, I've gone for a walk to get my lunch. So that's really important. And I think one of the other things to think about, and you spoke about this earlier in the opening comments, in terms of where women typically get represented, you know, retail, hospitality, travel, in major corporations like my own. I mean, law does very well in Asia, thank goodness, but it also typically tends to be concentrated in marketing and HR teams. What about the operational roles? What about leading some of the chief operating officer or other roles that eventually lead to CEO? So we need to provide truly flexible roles for women so that they can be challenged and they can still achieve their career goals. And I think that's super important.
Thanks, Leonie. Some really interesting observations there. And I think I see all of our fellow panelists nodding vigorously when you're talking about what we call the double burden with, you know, both being the, what did you say, the managing director and the homemaker and the chief bottle washer simultaneously. And I know, as I can't see you on camera, there's another 100 heads out there nodding in vigorous agreement. What I am really curious about sometimes, quite frankly, is how much of that is being experienced by men who are equally working from home, and whether that has shifted any of those dynamics. But maybe we can unpack that a little bit more in the question time. Georgette, I wanted to turn to you and talk for a minute about resilience. And resilience is a word that we hear used a lot during difficult times. We're hearing it from our politicians when we talk about economic resilience. We're hearing it, you know, from leaders. It's sort of you know, it's a word, it's a thing. But I'm really interested in what it means to you and how you think resilience matters to women, both personally and professionally, as part of our toolkit as, you know, as leaders during this period.
Thank you, Penny, and good afternoon to everybody. Resilience, and I think you're absolutely right. It's a word that gets bandied around. It's used a lot. We very often associate it with women being more resilient than men, meaning our threshold for pain is perhaps a little higher. And it probably is true in that respect. I think what we forget is that resilience isn't just this automatic, immediate bounce back reaction. It isn't a trampoline that, you know, you hit it and you're down in a minute and you're back up the next, and everything's right. I think we very often forget that process, it is a process, and it could be slow, it could be painful, and it doesn't always go the way we want it to be. So I think we have to be cognizant of that as part of that resilience journey. And you know, we all face it in different situations. I think what COVID and the pandemic and the lockdowns that we've all been experiencing in this part of the world has really brought to bear is that women in particular need to be better prepared. All right. So in order to be resilient, we have to be better prepared. And that preparedness comes from, you know, digging deep. It's going into whether it's saving, it's squirreling away a little bit extra every month, you know, to make sure that you have that nest egg. It's, you know, being smart about your investments. It's about making sure you have your insurance tied up, you know, neatly and readily available. It's all those things that one does to be prepared. But it's not just about being able to cope with, you know, a sudden job loss or a sudden stream of revenue and income, you know, being shut off, being furloughed, and again, you know, not having work for a period of time. This preparedness is an important piece that I think we women need to do a better job of. And it's part of taking better care of ourselves. It's part of investing in ourselves, if you were. And it's also getting us ready for what's next in life. And again, not being subject to a pandemic or something that is completely out of our control. It may be something that we plan for. So whether it's being ready to to jump on an opportunity to start a business. All right, and what do you do as you prepare for that while still working in your company? It's preparing for your next, career shift, midlife career shift, going into technology when you weren't in a tech role before. It's going into planning for your retirement. Women don't actually prepare for that enough, I feel. So the aspect of resilience comes about certainly if you're better prepared. And I think that's where the conversation needs to pivot. How do we become better prepared, not just for pandemics, which roll around ever so often, every few dozen years or so, but if you look at opportunities that may present themselves, how do you better prepare for those?
Thank you, Georgette. And it's very interesting, your point that preparedness and resilience doesn't just relate to the pandemic, but is something that as women we should be thinking about in all aspects of our lives. I was quite surprised to find out, returning to Australia from Singapore, like the only I've been away for a very long time, that in fact the data suggests that in Australia women have far less superannuation and far less savings on the whole. Roughly at about, I think the correct data, the correct number is about 2/3 of the level of men across our community. And that's got profound implications as the population ages and for women's, well-being over the longer term, both, financial and psychological. It's very interesting. So a really important point and well made that resilience is about preparedness, and it's also about self-care in many ways and anticipation. I wanted to turn a little bit to talking about our personal and professional journeys. One of the topics I think that it's important for our participants, and they're very interested in hearing about this, to hear about is your personal and professional journeys as leaders and how you feel your journey has equipped you for leadership in your organization. And secondly, some of the ways in which we think organizations are going to change and evolve post-COVID that will help better support women's leadership. Leonie's actually already made some interesting observations about the ways in which COVID could, we hope, spark some long-term change. And Jenny, if I just go back to you for a minute and have you reflect on your career journey and your personal journey and what in that journey has equipped you as a woman leader for success.
The main thing I think for me is really a role model. So many people have spoken to me, women, young women especially, about their career progressions, how they can achieve partnership or sort of management positions in law firms or outside of law in in-house positions as well. And I very often get this refrain, which is, I don't know how you do it. So a number of times I've heard that. And that to me seems to imply that a lot of young women are really trying to find a way. And they're desperately sort of looking up and trying to find a female role model. And when they find one, even then I think they're still a little bit in disbelief. So that's why I don't know how you do it. Because from, I think, where you're sitting maybe as a mid-level career senior associate, you just look up and it just seems really far away and difficult. And I think in a way it's up to the organization to make leadership achievable, and as well as something that young people today want. A lot of young people might say that I look at how difficult and how hardworking sort of management are, and I'm not sure I want this sort of life. I want a family, I want to have young kids. And I think it's sort of quite sad why people think there's naturally going to be a sacrifice in that order. I mean, I've always had a really strong role model, and that's my mother. My mother's had a career and she's always worked. So I never really had a stay-at-home mother. I mean, for me, it's always having to manage, getting my mom off work and doing things. And I think that's something I've really aspired to. And that also hit really closely to home in terms of when my father passed away when I was in university. So during that time, my mom had 3 kids to support and to put through school. And I think that was something that really resonated for me when I was a young sort of woman, thinking that, right, as a woman, you've always got to be independent. You've got to stand on your own 2 feet, and you've always got to make sure you have the ability to support yourself and your family. And on top of that, I think what has really made a difference to me in my career sort of progression has been sponsoring and sort of role models and mentoring. I mean, that is absolutely crucial. If you have an organization today that is serious about D&I, then you've really got to look towards your female talent pipeline, identify women, and actively sponsor and mentor them. I mean, I cannot stress the importance of someone when I was a mid-level associate reaching out to me and saying, I believe you can do this. You know, are there sort of difficult and career enhancing positions you can put your hands up for, speak up when it comes to committee roles. I think it's really crucial that young women get the opportunity and the confidence to think that this is something, and leadership is within reach.
Ginny, thanks for that. That's it's very interesting that you focused on sponsorship. Can I just ask you for a minute to talk about the difference between sponsorship and mentorship? Because I think often people confuse the two, and we know that men are actually twice as likely as women in the workplace to have sponsors. So what distinguishes a sponsor from a mentor from your perspective?
For me, I think a mentor is almost like a work friend to speak to, someone senior, someone that you share your experiences, that it's a listening ear. A sponsor, I think it's different. A sponsor, I think for me, is someone who is in a position in the organization to help you succeed in your career. I mean, that is a very pointed goal. It's not someone who's just listening to you and helping you to achieve your goals. That person will think about you when it comes to, like I said, you know, for careers, you need sort of those stretch positions where you put your hand up, and that if you shine, people can see, oh, wow, you know, I can really see this person as a future leader of the firm. So someone to actively speak for you and advocate for you in terms of getting to your stated objectives. So that's just a little bit extra, I think.
Absolutely. And often it can be difficult, I think, for women with sponsorship, because often the executives in organizations are actually men at the moment, because women are not as well represented at senior levels. So finding the right person above you, doesn't have to be a woman, can sometimes be a bit trickier for women. So I've heard. Jessica, turning to your personal and professional journey, would you like to share some reflections with us on how you've developed as a woman leader?
Sure. Thank you, Penny. I would like to share some thoughts on that. To give everyone a little bit of background to who I am, I'm based here in Singapore, but I'm an Australian. I've been working in energy and natural resources for my entire career, partly because I'm from Perth, so there's only a few options.
Yeah.
Luckily, I really enjoy it. It's really exciting. And it gave me the opportunity to come up into Asia and to work here and to work on projects around, you know, developing economies in the region, and that's been very interesting. So I've been here for 5.5 years. I think a lot of the times people have asked me, oh, you know, natural gas and LNG and those industries they're very male dominated. Do you find that difficult? And it's a bit of a mixed bag, really. I would say there's been a huge number of times that I've gone to meetings or events, and I've been the only woman in the room, like the only woman in sight, and that's been quite difficult. You know, it's in the professional setting, in business meetings and negotiations, certainly, but also even attending industry events. I always recall I just moved up to Singapore, and I went along to a major industry conference, and there was a networking drinks session in the evening. So I went along to that, and I didn't really know anyone there, and I was approached by 2 women, and we started having a chat. And then one of them said, so what does your husband do? You're here with your husband for the conference. And I was shocked. So yeah, it's definitely a male dominated industry. But that being said, I can't think of any times where I have been actively discriminated against or had opportunities taken from me because I'm a woman, and that's fantastic. But there's certainly still that underlying level of, you know, a male dominated culture and the certain unconscious biases that I think a lot of people still carry with them. And sometimes that has been difficult, and especially in the context as, you know, I'm a lawyer and in a professional services industry, we have our clients, so there's always somewhat of a power imbalance in that sort of situation. So there has certainly been a couple of times where people have said things or made little comments that I wish that I had been able to respond to. You know, sometimes I've been shocked and not been able to respond, and other times, you know, it doesn't seem appropriate in the moment. So I think one thing that I have really benefited from is having strong supporters around me who are able to see that behavior and call it out when it's happened, and help to put me onto a level footing with the others in the room. I can think of a couple of examples. One in particular, so in a previous role, many years ago now actually, I was advising a client on a deal, and we were invited to a negotiation meeting. We arrived at the meeting from separate offices, and I arrived second. And the lead negotiator for the counterparty said to my client, "Oh, what's this? You've left your lawyer behind." And my client, I think he was joking. I think he thinks he was joking. Said something, cracked a joke along the lines of, "Oh, it doesn't matter. You know, the ladies talk too much. We tune them out anyway," or something along those lines, which was so shocking to me in the moment. But how could I couldn't really say anything. You know, there's definitely a power imbalance there. But I was so impressed that the counterparty in the meeting, the lead negotiator, stopped the meeting and said, I'm sorry, I just have to stop this meeting and say that comment wasn't appropriate. And I hope we don't have a repeat of that. Let's move on. So I think I've really benefited from, although there are times when it's difficult in that male-dominated environment, there's certainly supporters out there. And I think that's one thing that men and women can equally do to help boost diversity, to support women, to help them work on a level footing with others. And that's to call out that behavior where it's possible to do so. You know, recognize a situation where someone has been challenged by that unconscious bias, but might not be in a position to recognize it or to call it out even if they do. So for me, I've benefited from that many times in my career, and I'm really grateful. And it's something I like to, I would like to think I can keep an eye out for as I progress as a leader.
Thank you, Jessica. That's really interesting. And I think making the point that as a lawyer working in a male-dominated field has actually had particular aspects to it that are quite different for you to navigate. You've got that intersection of the two as a professional woman. It's really interesting. Thank you. Georgette, I'm going to turn to you and ask for reflections on your journey. But in doing that, I'd like to note that in addition to pursuing your career and being a senior professional woman, you've also stepped up very, very publicly as an advocate for women and women's leadership through both your work with Board Agenda, Singapore's women's board advocacy organization, and also, of course, with United Women in Singapore. I'd be very interested if you could share some reflections for us through your personal lens, but really about what we're seeing from that organizational perspective as well, about how women in leadership are traveling in the corporate sector.
Sure. Oh, thank you, Penny. And Penny, if anybody knows me, it's you, since we've sat on boards together and we've journeyed together in empowering women here in Singapore. So absolutely, I think I was, as part of that journey, I was very, very fortunate. And I came from public sector, both in Singapore, Hong Kong, and then obviously moved into private sector for a long stretch. And while I was at MasterCard, you know, credit to them, they gave me the opportunity to develop the women's strategy here in Asia, in Asia Pacific. And at the same time, also overlaid that with the CSR strategy for the organization. So that was really kind of where it started. And that's really kind of where it whet my appetite. Now, I'm a late entry into this space. And you know, this is really a point that says it's never too late to get into giving and giving back, but and supporting the causes that you are most passionate for. But you know, let me also say to the younger ones who are out there, it's never too early to do the same too. So you know, I would strongly advise anybody who's passionate about the cause, take it up, get involved. But yes, absolutely, it was to me the passion. It was the passion of the cause. It was what got me jumping out of bed every morning. So when there was an opportunity for me to say, okay, from a timing perspective, I was really ready to devote my time, my energies to supporting women and the cause here in Singapore, whether it's at this highest level of bringing women into C-suite and getting a space at that director's table, to, you know, helping women, the disadvantaged women, or building that pipeline of future women leaders and cultivating young girls and getting them onto that path, and you know, STEM subjects being that pathway for many of them. That's what I love best. And that's what gets me out of bed every morning. And I'm just lucky that I get to do it. But at the same time, it's obviously a lot of effort. There's a lot of interest in this space. We're seeing it from many of our corporate partners. We're seeing a lot of individuals come forward. And you know, I will say one thing, during this period of COVID, there's been, I think, a stripping away of, you know, the veneer of society here, and people are seeing where help is needed. People are coming forward, and maybe that ties back into what we're talking about today too, about leadership. You don't have to be a CEO to be a leader. You don't have to, you know, head up a company to be a leader. I think absolutely that certainly helps, because if you've got influence, if you've got networks, if you've got the ability to move things along, that's fantastic. But I think everybody has an opportunity to be a leader, whether it's in the community, in a smaller outreach organization, and that's what we should be, you know, encouraging. Whether it's the very young, the teenagers in the early 20s, all the way to, you know, people who've decided they want to take early retirement, but still have a lot to contribute to. So I think that's really what we're seeing now. It's actually an opportunity for people to be doing a whole lot more to get society back together, to make it a lot more inclusive and cohesive. Because it's very fragmented, as we know, in many parts of the world. But hopefully, you know, we're able to get past that and actually work together and give back and help those along the way. And it's not just about a donation. I think those obviously help, as you know, Penny. But it's not just that hand out, it's the hand up that very often actually women need the most. It's the opportunity, it's access, education certainly plays a part, technology certainly plays a part, but it's about that opportunity.
Thank you, Georgette, and thank you so much for your passion. I'm always so humbled hearing about your sort of deep inner passion for bettering the lives of other women and supporting their leadership. Leonie, there's so many different ways I'd like to ask you these questions. As a woman leader in the technology sector and in STEM, a sector where women are still very underrepresented, but also as someone who works for a company that is quite well known for its cutting edge policies on diversity and its commitment in this space. It would be really interesting if you were willing to share some reflections from your perspective, both professional and personal.
Thanks for the question, Penny. Look, it's an interesting one. If you look at STEM particularly, there is a problem in terms of attracting young women into STEM industries. Computer science is no different. In Australia, Hong Kong, England and the US, the number of female graduates from computer science programs, which are some of the highest paying jobs these days when you leave university. I mean, you can command a 6-figure salary straight out of a master's in Silicon Valley right now from computer engineering. So they're very, very well paying jobs. Only 19% of the students are female, 1 in 5, and far fewer than that actually get jobs. A lot of them, by the time they've finished their degrees, have already worked out that they don't like the industry, they don't like the culture, and they don't feel like they fit in, which is actually really sad. We do a much better job on the business sides of the organisation. So when we look at, legal, finance, admin, sales and service teams, etc., there's far more representation of women. But at the senior levels, you're still probably only talking, for most organisations, whether it's tech or telco, somewhere between 20 and say 27% female representation at whatever director level and above. So we still do have a problem. I think part of it, especially having lived and worked in Asia and managed teams across Asia, there's a couple of different things at play, and it's not as simple as a male-female equation anymore, because ethnicity, sexuality, obligations with family all come into play. So there's, for me, and a few years ago I coined not just the glass ceiling's been around for a long time, but I talked about the tech trapdoor. And the tech trapdoor is actually really very real. So women in their 30s who are, some are deciding to have families, some have the obligation of elderly parents, or some, might be thinking about what they might have made a wrong choice in their career and thinking about completely changing their career entirely. So we have all of these things sort of happening in the 30s. Also, if you look at the data, a lot of women tend to step out and try and start their own businesses at these times. So they might go off and be an individual consultant because they're just sick of the ladder. They're sick of the push. They're sick of not necessarily fitting in or finding a culture where they feel like they can be themselves, right? So one of the things that, we need to make sure that we're doing is to avoid that tech trapdoor, is build cultures where women can thrive. And a culture where women can thrive is not necessarily about, do we put a beauty bar in? Well, no, maybe not. Do we make sure that people get equally heard and recognised for their ideas? Yes. Do we recognise that there are cultural differences in how, for example, North Asian women and men have some fairly similar traits in terms of meeting behaviour, particularly in a second language like English? Mm-hmm. Do we make accommodation for that to allow them to be successful? Do we make sure that we're levelling the playing field so that the opportunities that we would provide to young women to help them succeed, we're now providing to millennial men who have decided that charity, board work is in their future. They don't necessarily want to be the money-making machine. Some of them actually, like my husband's a stay-at-home dad. I have numbers of young men in my organisation say, what's it like for your husband, right? Because for some of them, they're actually thinking, good Lord, I never thought that was a choice for me. And for some of them culturally, depending on whether they're Southeast Asian or Northeast Asian, it has never been talked about in their family. Yeah. And so there's some, across the region, there's some really different things that we have to think about in terms of how we create these cultures in organisations where women can thrive, but equally men can thrive as well. So that we basically have, the right combination of not equality. And I saw this great cartoon the other day of equality versus equity. And equality was, the small child, the middle child and the dad actually having the same height of box to try and look over the fence. So of course the smallest child can't see over the fence, if you've seen that one. Yes. And when we go with equity, we actually change the levels of the boxes so that everybody's head is at the same level and we can all see over the fence. So I think a lot of the conversation really should be about how do we make not only these organisations where women can thrive, but we provide equity in terms of how we think about performance rating, how we think about dishing out opportunities, where the special projects go and all of those sorts of things. And I think that's probably the only way that we're going to be able to address inequity.
Thank you, Leonie. I love that. A way that I sometimes talk about that equity and ensuring that you change the size of the box is actually ensuring that everybody can bring their best selves to work. And, you know, whether that's gender diversity or cultural diversity, whatever it is in terms of people's, you know, essential needs, it's actually recognizing that enormous diversity, and that, you know, if we create a culture where people can be their best selves in the workplace as well as at home, then everybody thrives.
It's exactly what I say to my team. I'm just trying to be the best me that I can be.
Yeah.
I'm a really poor impersonation of somebody else. So I'm just stuck with trying to be my best me, and that's it.
Yeah, I love that idea. We have some questions here, and I would just encourage anybody, please, to pop your question in the Q&A box for us, because we can see you. We have a great question from Marianne about differences between the way that men and women are treated in the workforce. And I was going to ask Jenny if she'd like to talk a little bit about that.
Well, firstly, it's generally against law to discriminate on a basis of gender. So generally, you know, there are always sort of little incidents that you hear from people. Like Jessica shared an example earlier about how you're automatically sort of assumed to be a spouse if you're attending a sort of energy sector. And I remember when I was actually on maternity leave, and I was meeting some other mothers in a playground watching our kids, and they asked, "Oh, what did you used to do?" And I said, "What do you mean? I still do it. I'm just on parental leave." But the assumption was that, you know, I'd given up my job to look after the kids. So I think it's unconscious bias for me. It's a really big thing in terms of organizations in tackling this. I mean, COVID, I think, is the great leveler. I mean, I loved Leonie's comment that this has all set us back essentially into ground zero. There are no sort of informal secret networks that you can get into, or boys clubs or gun clubs or any of that. I mean, we're all on Zoom. This is it. Everyone has an equal chance to contribute, to speak up, and to put your hand up. So, I mean, I would love to see the research that comes out after COVID, just to see how far we've come in terms of gender diversity, and whether this has really made a difference in moving the scale. In terms of the other things that I think, you know, lots of organizations have already addressed this, but I think, I mean, at Ashurst, for example, we have instituted parental leave. So previously, you know, it was very much talked about in terms of maternity leave, and organizations would still sort of stop and worry about employing women at around 30s age, where they think they're going to disappear off after having babies. So I think things like this that organizations can really help to deal with. I think most big organizations have dealt with. So we've got parental leave, and that's 18 weeks minimum, and up to a year that you can take off. And we've got lots of sort of clubs that we've set up. So we've got something called Caring Responsibilities, or a Carers Club, and that's for men and women, just to recognize that it's not only women who could be carers of either children or old people or sick people in the families. And men very much are encouraged to join in the discussion about that as well. I think third is really on flexibility in terms of making sure that whatever we've gained through COVID, this whole experience of not presenteeism, of not being at your desk, and, you know, making sure that your interactions are mindful, not sending an email for the sake of it. I really hope that this will continue, you know, beyond sort of COVID, when people do return back to the office eventually, and that these sort of best practices can really stay on for the next generation. And, you know, for us all to remember to keep having this conversation on equal opportunities for everyone. Because, I mean, what really gets me when we talk about the D&I agenda is a certain sector, be it men or someone else, you know, saying, what about us, right? Why is it about sort of pushing women up? It's not about sort of pushing women up. It's just making sure that it's an equal playing field, so that everyone has an equal chance to succeed and thrive. So I think there are still sort of gender gaps in terms of salaries, in terms of pay. I mean, a lot of it is historical, and what we can do, I think, as leaders of the organizations we are in now, is to address this in the pipeline, to make sure that we are building in change, and to make sure that we are changing sort of the attitudes for our future pipeline.
Thank you very much, Ginny. That's, and again, I can see amongst our participants lots of nodding heads, even if the cameras aren't on. It's very, very helpful. There is actually a related question that's come through from Rebecca in Australia and Leonie. She's asked you, given the blokey culture in Australia, and dare I say, having lived in Asia as well, it's not unique to Australia, but given the blokey culture in Australia, how do we get men to sort of step up and take more of the burden at home and with children, and to support women in their careers better?
Yeah, look, it's a tricky one, and I can only talk about my own personal experience. I got this question, and I did a panel years ago in India, and because I think it's quite unique in India to have a stay-at-home dad. I don't think it's much of a concept. And in fact, what I actually said, which I think might have upset a few people in the audience, was choose wisely. When you choose your life partner, have these conversations before, right? So from an individual woman perspective, if you expect somebody who's going to be an equal partner in work and life, then you probably need to have that conversation before you sign the contract. I was very lucky. My husband and I have been together for 32 years now. I met him at university, and very early on I said to him, so, because he was the product of two working parents. My mother didn't work. She gave up her career at HSBC when she met my father in Hong Kong. So, you know, we had very different experiences growing up, but I asked him, I said, you know, if this works out and one day we have kids, do you think one of us should stay home? And he said, oh yeah, I think that'd be good, because he felt like he missed out. I said, okay, so how should we decide who should stay home? Should it be the one that earns the most money? And he goes, well, that's going to be you. And I said, that's right. Just hold that thought for a while. So, but in all seriousness, we've always had a very good partnership. We're very different people. He ran his own business during the 90s. He sold that very successfully. I took that money, I put it in a tech startup, and I lost it all. And so, you know, from that moment, we kind of had this agreement that he'd done a lot of his hard work and he deserved a little bit of time out. Now, being a full-time dad is not time out. I would actually argue it is the much harder job. And if I'm really honest, for me, being a stay-at-home mum is not my chosen career. I am a much better, higher quality mother when I work. That's just me. When you're talking about the experience inside work organisations, right? Google's actually done quite a good job of this. When I first went on maternity leave in Australia, I didn't get a single day of paid leave. And I had all of the well-meaning men in my office saying goodbye tearfully forever because, you know, you were never coming back like my wife, without them realising that my husband was about to give up his job to take care of our children. So I didn't get any pay. Second time around, I did get 4 months pay, but at that time we didn't have paternity leave as a concept. Google recently introduced 6 months full pay for women and 3 months full pay for men. And men can take that in a couple of tranches. So, you know, I was really proud. I had a transferring man into my team. He was transferring from another team to be my head of go-to-market. At the time that he was transferring, his wife was pregnant, and he was honest enough to tell me that, and I was honest enough to tell him back that he was entitled to 3 months off before he even started his role, and that would be okay. So even during that interviewing process, he wasn't aware. He wasn't aware that he could have this time to be with his family. And it's remarkable what you see from these men when they come back after having, you know, either 2 6-week tranches or fully 3 months off with their wives. And they're just so much better at understanding the cues and the stresses and the distraction of having a couple of children at home and what that can actually do to you and how they need to step up and help. And now this particular individual, as we're working from home, will actually often send me notes and say, you know, even when we got back to the office briefly in Hong Kong, would say, you know, I'm going to work from home today because my wife actually needs a break. Now that's awesome. This is the generation of 20s and 30 somethings that are coming through. It was not my generation, but employers can help by also making sure that men get extended paid paternity leave, not just a couple of days, not just 5 days, but months. And that will actually help them in terms of embedding them in their relationship with their wife, fantastic, or other, depending. You know, you might be a female-female or a male-male partner as well. The same benefits actually apply. But also in the workplace, what does that do for you? It builds amazing loyalty. And I just think it's fantastic. If we truly want to talk about family-friendly cultures, we have to entertain this idea that, you know, we also should be sharing not even the burden, but it's the joy of when you bring a baby home and you have those first 3 to 6 months. That's time you never get back, and it's time well spent.
Thanks, Leonie. That's some fantastic insights and actually really practical. It's, I think, a great credit to those companies who have recognized the need for paternity leave as well as maternity leave, and actually to level the playing field, both for men and women, to make, you know, again, the decisions that are going to fulfill them, not just when they're having babies, but when they have caring responsibilities and want to take career breaks, but that actually that then plays back both positively in the organization as well as in the home. So it's kind of a win-win. I wanted to call out 2 things from our question and answer. First of all, Robin Wilson. Robin, hello, and thank you very much for joining. It's great that you're with us. Robin wanted to suggest a book, which is Why Working From Home is Not Necessarily Good for Women. And it's Harvard Business Review, so it's probably an article actually, by Ibarra Gillard, as in Julia, the former Prime Minister of Australia, and Primozic. So we'll just put a note of that. If you haven't seen it already in the questions, we can send that around. And we have, I think it's actually going to be our last question. We have a great question from Karen Loon. Hello, Karen. And I'm going to read it because Karen actually makes some really important points in this question. And Karen is an incredibly well-known diversity advocate. So traditional diversity and inclusion management focuses on fixing the diverse candidates and some D&I bias training. Some would argue that D&I training is not necessarily effective. I would argue that organizations really need to focus on ensuring their stated and lived values, culture and behaviors are aligned. If the values, culture and behaviors are not aligned, there could be risks to the organization, including reputational risk, as we've seen in the Australian media over the past few days. I'm assuming, Karen, there you're referring to the AMP situation. What are your thoughts on this to the panel, including on ensuring the behaviours of middle management are appropriate? And I would just add, and aligned. So in summary, I think Karen makes a really good point that sometimes the policies are there and the practices are there, but in fact, there's not really an alignment between the stated and the behaviours that get tolerated in organisations. Did anyone want to comment on that?
I'm happy to speak on that. I think living the values is what's really important. So you can have all the policies in the world and you've got handbooks for everything, etc. But if no one is actually living and breathing the values, then, you know, that people know that that's not what the organization stands for anyway. And when you talk about living the values and what a culture of an organization is, I mean, someone asked a good question. I mean, what actually is the culture of a place? And I like to think of it in terms of this is who you hire, who you fire, and who you promote, right? So it's making sure that you are standing behind in terms of what your organization is standing for, ensuring that there is accountability. So the mid-management level, I think that's where people feel it the most in terms of any unconscious bias, in terms of not getting the best assignments or the jobs, the stretch jobs to be able to make it to sort of senior leadership positions. And it's ensuring that level of sort of senior and mid-level leaders are truly sort of conscious and making sure that they are promoting the best talent. And it's sort of bringing people along for the ride. So I think this is really a journey for a lot of people on where they are in the D&I scale. So some people, often the people who attend the trainings and who come to webinars like these are people who are already woke, right? So they are very much aware of the issues. They are involved in the conversations and they are talking. The challenge, I think, for any organization is how you bring along people who aren't involved, who aren't attending these webinars, who don't turn up for unconscious bias trainings. And I think it's really in terms of, I mean, you've got to use the carrot and the stick approach, right? So, you know, what sort of incentives can you have, and making sure that there is some sort of collective, well, not shaming, but just a collective responsibility that you as a leader or as a senior manager of an organization need to do this, basically, for you to have a long-term successful career with this company.
So Penny, let me just jump in at this point too. I think in many organizations, I totally agree with what both Karen and what Ginny is saying. It's obviously about values and it's got to be baked into the culture. Then only will it stick. But we all know very often it's dependent on whoever is leading the organization, whoever is the CEO, because everything else cascades from what the CEO, what he or she says, and lives by example and walks that talk. So that's really critical. If you've got leadership that are truly believing in diversity and inclusion and who live that every day, and go out of the way to teach that every day to others, then I think you stand a chance. Otherwise, you know, it is going to go by the wayside. You know, very often you have all these unconscious bias training sessions that are set up. Half people turn up, half the people don't turn up. They're doing other things, right? We've all seen that in the organizations that we've been in. But at the end of the day, if senior management says everybody's going to be accountable, it's a responsibility, not just for your D&I chief or your HR department, but it's everybody's KPI. Then I think you're starting that conversation. You're taking those first few steps. And it's not going to happen overnight. We all know that, but it's a start.
Thank you, Georgette. Well, I'm really conscious that we're close to time for today. And I'd like to thank all of our fabulous panelists and our participants for a great discussion. But what I'd like to do is to finish with something on a positive note. And I'd like to actually ask each of our panelists for one thought, one reflection on what during this challenging period with COVID has been a positive outcome for you and something that you'd like to share with others. Jessica, would you like to kick off?
Sure, thanks, Penny. For me, I think, you know, amongst all of the challenges of this pandemic, there have been a number of positives. If I had to pick just one from a professional level, I've been really inspired by seeing the rate of change and what's possible. I think we have in the past used a lot of excuses around flexible work and things like that. You know, the technology won't work, how we manage everyone's schedule, and now we've been pushed into that direction where it had to happen. And you know, those excuses around flexible work, I think, will fall away. But it's for our benefit. It's fantastic in a lot of ways, and I think it's going to be very helpful for both men and women. Because, you know, I really enjoyed the discussion a bit earlier when we were talking about opening up those opportunities to men to do, you know, parental leave and things like that. I think there's benefits for all in working flexibly when we need to. So this pandemic has shown that it's possible and organizations can move quicker than they think they can, and people can adapt to change quicker than they think they can as well. Even in conservative places like law firms, we've managed to adapt, you know, and it's working well. So for me, I've really enjoyed that aspect of the pandemic, and I hope that we can take some of that positive change and keep working flexibly in future.
Thanks, Jessica. That's fantastic. That's a really, really positive thought. Can I go next to you, Leonie?
I'm not used to be called next because Valentine, I'm always last. But
bad luck.
Yeah, I know. I was just reflecting on. I've spent pretty much the last decade in thinking about how I manage my career on building capacity. I got coaching and advice, you know, sort of in my late 30s, early 40s about what was holding me back. And it wasn't skills, capabilities, a little bit of experience. I probably could have used some broader and particularly global experiences, which is why I moved to Hong Kong. But this particular coach said to me it was really capacity and building that capacity to handle things that other people in equivalent positions to me or organisations couldn't necessarily handle, and that would help to set me apart. So I've been really focused on that for a decade in terms of how do I put myself in situations where I can build these kind of, not just resilience, but capacity to handle things. And I think one positive benefit of, you know, dual crises in Hong Kong of protests and pandemic is that I now recognise that I have the capacity to lead very scaled and complex teams through extremely tough times, and all the while I can maintain both my health, well-being and sense of humour. And so I think, you know, for me personally, it's actually been, whilst it's a challenging time, it's personally quite a rewarding time to reflect on that.
That's fabulous. Thank you. And Georgette?
Actually, I'm gonna stretch that out a little bit. On the personal side, I think one of the clear positives that's come about, I've gotten to spend tons of time with my husband, who, as you know, Penny, travels all the time. So he's been homebound and he's loving it too. And we've gotten to hang out with our two girls who've been in Singapore. So that's been amazing. It's been terrific. But outside of the family front, I think something that we've seen in society, that society stepping up to help all those who have been, you know, impacted severely by COVID, by the pandemic, by losing jobs, people opening up their hearts and opening up their wallets, coming up with amazing, innovative ideas to raise funds. And suddenly I think the exposure and the awareness of these groups that really need help, but also groups of people who are also willing to help. I think that's a real positive that's actually come about from what is obviously a bad situation. And one hopes that we are able to continue the good work that has come about, and these really positive feelings and the commitment will stay true.
Thank you. That's really interesting, the reflection on how it's actually brought forward a different kind of humanity. Thanks, Georgette. And Ginny, our fabulous host.
I think COVID has sort of given everyone an opportunity to breathe and to reset. Right? For a lot of people, I think it's just been a chance to stop and to really take check of what's important in your life at the moment. So that sort of rebalancing, I think, of people's priorities. I mean, I hope that people continue with that mindset that, you know, that there is a chance to sort of, if you had to go back to ground zero, how would you do this, right? Basically, how would you set your life up? How would you go to work? How would you approach education for children? So I think that sort of fresh mindset is really important. And given that everyone's gone through that, I think you go through various stages. So one is sort of that stage of loss that people have felt. And now sort of getting that back, once that sort of sense of loss has gone, and how you sort of cope with that and become stronger as a result. The secondary benefit, I think, of COVID, I mean, what I've loved is that it's just the environmental aspects, right? So Hong Kong, as people know, has really been a city on steroids for a long time. The number of sort of luxury stores that you get on a single street is just crazy. I mean, compared to anywhere else in the world, right? London, New York, etc. So it's sort of, I think, a rebalancing back to a slightly more normal way of living, a more sustainable and more mindful way of living. And I love that, for example, dolphins are coming back to Hong Kong waters again. So the wildlife's coming back. So, you know, hopefully that is an uplifting message and an uplifting outcome for when we all survive post-COVID.
That's a gorgeous thought. sustainability is a really interesting thought, and that kind of mindfulness going forward. So with that, I'm going to bring our event today to a close. Let me first of all say an enormous thanks to the panel. I think that was a really interesting conversation, and let me say how much I know all of our participants would have appreciated you committing with so much integrity and sharing so much of yourselves actually in the discussion. I think it's really inspiring. I also wanted to thank all of the participants for making available time today. And we'd be very grateful if when this finishes, there's a short survey link, and we'd love to hear from you on what you found useful today and what we might do differently going forward. And with that, huge thanks, and please take care and stay safe going forward. So goodbye and thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.